everyone! Today I am going to be doing my pretty late April wrap-up. I am very late to filming this because I've been having a lot of trouble with my computer, which has made editing videos really difficult, which has then made finding motivation to film videos even more difficult. So thusly this video is kind of late, but I guess better late than never. So let's just jump into these statistics and not dilly-dally too much because I actually read 13 books in April, so this might be kind of a long video. I'm gonna try not to ramble too much. So I read 13 books and a grand total of about 2,451 pages. I actually read quite a lot of audiobooks this month, so I don't usually count audiobook pages towards my total page count, but if I did, it would probably be over 3,000 pages. As for genres, I read 2 romances, 3 nonfiction books, 2 poetry collections, 1 thriller, 1 contemporary, 2 classics, 1 fantasy, and 1 historical fiction. 5 of the books were audiobooks, and then 8 of them were physical reads, which is very unlike me. I don't even think I've ever listened to 5 audiobooks in 1 year, much less in 1 month. So that was a little bit different. As far as ratings, I had 2 2-star reads, 4 3 stars, 1 3.5 star, 3 4 stars, 1 4.5 star, and 2 5-star reads. 11 of the books were adult, 1 was YA, and 1 was middle grade, and 1 was a part of a series, and the other 12 were all standalone books. 5 of them, which was all 5 of the audiobooks, I borrowed from my Overdrive app. Now, a couple of them I did actually own physically, but because I borrowed the audiobook, I decided to count it as being borrowed, even though I did actually own a physical copy of the book. So 5 of them were borrowed, 8 of them I already owned, and then, as you know, I like to go over the years that the different books were released. So 3 of them were collections that were written at all different times, like all of the stories within the collection were written at all different times. So I didn't write down those years, but as for the other books, we have a 2016, 2016, 2018, 2020, 2016, 2012, 1922, 2011, 2015, and 2015. So that is all for the statistics. Now let's just jump into the books I read. So the first book I picked up in April was It Ends With Us by Colleen Hoover. This is a new adult romance novel. It's kind of difficult to explain a plot for this, but I'm going to try my best. Basically, we're following our main character Lily, and her father has recently passed away, and she's kind of having a hard time processing it because her father was very abusive to her mother when she was younger, and she never understood why her mother stayed with him all this time until his passing. So she's at the top of a rooftop just kind of trying to process this, and she ends up meeting a man up there and forming a relationship with him. Also, it's very windy outside, so I'm sorry if it's really loud in the background, but most of the story we're following their storyline, but then we do also get flashback scenes through journal entries of her when she was a younger teenager and her having to deal with her parents, and then also a homeless boy moving into an abandoned house behind theirs, and she ends up trying to take care of him and give him food and then forms a relationship with him. So we're kind of following 2 stories. I also do have to give a trigger warning for domestic abuse in this book, and it also is new adult, so it does have some explicit sex scenes. So if any of that bothers you, then I wouldn't recommend picking up this book. But this is actually a reread for me. I think I originally read this in 2018, and I really loved it, so I was a bit nervous picking it up again because I'm always worried that I'm not going to love it as much, but I think I loved it even more the second time around, which I didn't think was possible. But I just love this book so much. It's one of those books that unfortunately I feel like a lot of people end up putting down without finishing it because they think it's really problematic, but you really have to read it until the end and also read the author's note to really get the full impact of this story because it's actually extremely moving and powerful. So yeah, I just love this book, and I would honestly love to get a sequel to this, but I am sure that I'll probably reread this lots and lots of times in the future, which I don't say about a lot of books, but this is one of those special ones. I then listened to the audiobook for Scrappy Little Nobody by Anna Kendrick. This is her memoir, and it was narrated by her. So I should preface this by saying I'm not the biggest Anna Kendrick fan. I think I've only seen her in Twilight and Into the Woods, so I don't dislike her by any means, but I'm just not the biggest fan of her because I just haven't seen a lot of her work. But I love listening to memoirs when they're narrated by the authors and just hearing people's life stories. I find it really interesting. Unfortunately, this one just wasn't that interesting to me. I felt like I was very bored with a lot of the stuff that she was talking about, so it just didn't really connect with me. I, again, don't really know her like outside of the things I've seen her in, so I don't really know what her personality is like, but some of this felt very forced in the kind of like sarcasm or humor that she had going on in here. Like some of it was actually funny, but some of it just felt kind of forced. There were also some parts in here that were like borderline offensive and problematic, and I'm honestly shocked that she was able to get away with this. For instance, there was this one part where she goes to, I think, McDonald's or something, and she goes there with like one of her guy friends, or it might have been like a boyfriend or an ex-boyfriend that she was still friends with or something like that, and he walks away and she says to the person behind the counter, "He beats me," and she thought it was like really funny, and I was like, that so obviously isn't. So I just don't know how she was able to get away with some of the stuff that was in this book, but overall it just wasn't really the book for me. I then picked up this collection of Emily Dickinson poetry. This is basically my first dive into poetry outside of Tim Burton and Dr. Seuss, and honestly maybe it's just because this is classic poetry and I'd probably have more luck with like modern contemporary poetry, but this just wasn't really for me. Again, like, I feel like I'm just not intellectual enough for poetry or classics. Like, both of those combined, I just feel really stupid when reading this. So I did tab a couple of poems that I did enjoy. It also had some great artwork in here, which I really liked, particularly that picture. So yeah, I don't like regret reading it. There were some parts that I did enjoy, but overall it just wasn't my favorite, and I don't know that I'd ever read any more of it. I then picked up my only young adult read of the month, and that was Starry Eyes by Jen Bennett. In this book, we are following Zori and Lennon, and they used to be really good friends when they were younger, but then due to something that happened, which I don't know if it's revealed at the beginning of this, so for the sake of spoilers, I'm not going to say what it is, but due to something that happened, they kind of grew apart and are avoiding each other and are like borderline enemies at this point, but then they end up accidentally going on a camping trip together because they had mutual friends and they didn't know that the other one was going, and then due to another event they actually end up stranded in the wilderness alone together. So this was a really cute contemporary romance story. I really, really loved this. If you like hate to love stories and or camping slash survival stories, this is definitely the book for you. This was just super cute all around. So far, every Jen Bennett book I've ever read I've loved, which at this point has only been 2, but I'm currently reading a 3rd one and I am loving that one also. So Jen Bennett is quickly becoming one of my favorite contemporary authors, like up there with Casey West, and you guys know how much I love Casey West. So yeah, I just really love this book. I loved the characters. I thought the story was super cute, and on top of all of that, Jen Bennett also has really diverse characters in here from sexuality and race, and in the book I'm currently reading, we're following characters that have like narcolepsy, and one of them is deaf in one ear, which I also think is a diversity that we should see more of in books. So I just really love what Jen Bennett is doing with her books, so I would highly recommend any of them, honestly. Then picked up Little Secrets by Jennifer Hillier. This is an adult thriller novel that was kindly sent to me from the publisher, so thank you so much to them for sending me this book. Basically, in this book we follow our main character called Marin, and she is shopping for Christmas a couple days before Christmas with her young 4-year-old son, and she turns her back for a moment, and when she turns back around, her son has been abducted. So in the main part of the story, I think it takes place like 15 months later, when the police have basically given up on trying to find her son because it's pretty much a cold case at this point. So Marin ends up hiring her own private investigator, and that investigator finds out that Marin's husband has been having an affair, and that's all I'm going to tell you about the plot because, as you know, I'm a firm believer in going into thrillers blind. So I was kind of torn with this book because, to be completely honest, for the first like 2/3 of this book, I was really bored. And it could be because it's very similar to a lot of other domestic thrillers that I read, so that might have been why I found it so boring. And if you're newer to the genre, maybe it would seem, you know, more new to you, but for me it just didn't feel like it brought anything new to the table. It didn't feel particularly original, so it was just kind of boring for the first 2/3. But then the last third happened, the twist, and it was actually pretty good, and I did not expect it at all, and the ending was also pretty good, and, you know, it was an overall satisfying ending. But that leaves me in a place where I'm like, well, was the ending good enough to, like, excuse the first 2/3 of boringness? Like, I don't really know. So I'm kind of torn as to whether I would recommend this book or not, because honestly, if I hadn't been sent this, I may have DNF'd it because it was boring and I wasn't really interested in picking it back up whenever I would put it down while I was reading it. So, but then the ending was good. So I'm really torn, honestly, on what I think of this book. I guess you're just gonna have to decide on your own as to whether you'd want to pick it up or not, because I really don't know if I would recommend it or not. So yeah, this is probably the most unhelpful review ever, but that's honestly how I felt about this book. I then picked up the audiobook for The Princess Diaries by Carrie Fisher. This was my second time listening to the audiobook and my third time just reading the book overall, and once again, I absolutely loved this. This is one of my favorite books of all time. I don't have enough good things to say about it, and I've been mentioning it a lot on my channel and just gushing about it, so I'm not going to talk any more about it here, but just know that I think everyone should read it, and that's that. Then picked up A Man Called Ave by Fredrik Backman. I'm still not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. I literally looked it up after I read this book to pronounce it correctly, but I still don't know if I'm saying it right. Hopefully I am. But this is a contemporary is what I considered it to be, but I don't know, I guess you'd call it like literary fiction or like whatever that is. Honestly, I've never categorized something as that in my life, but I think that's what you would call this. Basically, in this book, we're following an older man who is a bit grumpy and very set in his ways. He's got a very particular routine in the way that he lives his life, and that ends up being disrupted by a new family that moves in next door, and also this stray cat that shows up around his house. So Fredrik Backman is a very popular writer and a very beloved writer. Like, he's a lot of people's favorite authors, and I have just never felt drawn to pick up any of his books. Whenever I hear the plot of any of his books, I think it sounds really boring, no offense. But so many people love him, so I felt like I was missing out, and I wanted to know, like, what was so great about his books. So I picked this one up secondhand, I read it, and I feel like I understand why people like it, and I appreciate it, and I did like this book. Like, I didn't dislike it by any means, but it just isn't the book for me. Like, it's a very nice story, but I feel like, and I enjoy a nice story, don't get me wrong, but there's just so many other kinds of stories I would much rather read than these kinds of stories. So while I did enjoy this and I do like appreciate his writing and everything like that, I just don't see myself picking up any more Fredrik Backman in the future just because there's so many other kinds of stories that I would prefer to read. Next up, we have The Last Seance by Agatha Christie. This is a collection of supernatural or paranormal short stories of hers. I really love Agatha Christie. I've basically loved everything I've ever read of hers, but unfortunately I think this was a little bit of a miss for me, and that could be because I've never really been a fan of short story collections. With any short story collection, there's going to be ones that you really love and ones that you really don't like, and a lot of these I wouldn't say that I really didn't like. They just kind of fell middle of the ground for me. A lot of them I felt like I was either confused with how they ended or really unsatisfied with how they ended, which I do feel like a lot of short stories leave me unsatisfied with how they ended because they're so short. But there were a couple in here that I did really like The Dressmaker's Doll and also Philomel Cottage, and there was another one that I can't remember what the title of it was, but it opened with them golfing, so if you know which one it is, I enjoyed that story also. So yeah, this was kind of a middle of the road book for me. Like, some of it I really liked, but a lot of it was just kind of so that's that. I then picked up this collection of William Shakespeare poetry slash some of his like sonnets and other things because I still wanted to try my hand at poetry and see if I could get along with it somehow, but again, I just don't think classical poetry is really for me, and especially not Shakespeare because I do not understand the language that this is written in. I didn't understand it when I had to read it in school, and I don't understand it now. I think I enjoyed this one a little bit less than the Emily Dickinson one because at least her language was a little bit easier for me to understand, whereas this one, like, by the end of it, I just felt so stupid because I was like, I don't understand what's going on. So that's all. So I then picked up the audiobook for The Velveteen Rabbit. This is a classic children's story, which I had actually never heard of before until I discovered this audiobook, and I'm so glad I did because this is just such a nice story. It's basically about this toy rabbit that it's a bit like Toy Story, like the toys in this nursery are kind of sentient and they can like talk to each other, but the rabbit is also told that like if a child like loves you so much that you can actually turn into like a real rabbit. And it starts off as like a really nice story, and then it gets really sad really quickly, and then I'm not going to tell you how it ends obviously, but this was just, it was kind of a roller coaster of emotions, but I really liked it and I'm really glad that I picked it up. I After that, I read The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern. This is an adult historical fantasy is what I would call it. It's mostly set in the late 1800s, and it's basically about this circus that is only open at night, and it's just a really kind of magical experience. So we're actually kind of following two different timelines. So the one is set in the late 1800s as we kind of see how this circus is formed and just how it becomes what it is and how it ends up affecting people. And at the same time, we're also following these two magicians that are in this kind of competition, and throughout the whole book you don't really know exactly why they're doing this or what exactly is going on, but for some reason you're really invested in it. And then the other timeline that we're following is in the early 1900s, and we're following a boy as he discovers the circus for the first time and how it ends up affecting him. And obviously the timelines kind of come together at the end. But yeah, I really loved this book, which I totally expected to because it sounds like everything that I love for some reason. Even though I've never been to a circus or a carnival, I'm obsessed with the idea of them, so I really thought I was gonna love this book, and I'm so glad that I did. I actually tried to read this book a couple of years ago, and I think I read the first chapter or two, and it didn't pull me in straight away, so I just immediately put it down because I was like, alright, I don't want to read it when I'm not gonna end up liking it. It has to be the right time for me to read this book, and I'm so glad I did put it down because I felt like when I read it now was the right time to read this book. My favorite thing about this book was probably the characters, but also the atmosphere. This is one of the most atmospheric books I've ever read, which was just an amazing experience. But also her writing wasn't too flowery, because sometimes atmospheric books can have very flowery writing, which I don't particularly like, so I enjoyed that it was atmospheric without having flowery writing. But I also loved the characters. There is something slightly morally gray about all of them, at least in my opinion. That's how I felt, and I love morally gray characters, so of course I loved the characters in this book. I will say that the only reason this wouldn't be a complete 5-star book, which I know I don't really mention ratings on my channel anymore, but if I was to rate this, it would be 4.5, so it's really good but not quite up there. And that reason is because the other storyline that we were following of the 1900s, following this other boy, I wasn't as invested in. I much preferred to follow the forming of the circus and these two magicians, so that was the only reason it didn't get a full 5 stars, was because I just wasn't as invested in that other storyline. Overall, I really loved this book, and I would totally recommend it, and I can definitely see this being a book that I reread lots of times in the future. I then listened to the audiobook for Go Set a Watchman by Harper Lee. This is the sequel to Kill a Mockingbird, which I always want to call To Kill a Mockingjay, which is just tragic at this point. I listened to the audiobook by Reese Witherspoon, and I honestly don't think I would have ever picked this book up if I hadn't found that audiobook, because while I did enjoy To Kill a Mockingbird and I appreciate it and I like the message that it sends out, I didn't love it enough to seek out reading the sequel, so I did pick this up secondhand last year or something with the intention of reading it at some point, which usually means maybe when I'm really old. So I really didn't expect to read this book anytime soon, but I'm so glad I found the audiobook because I actually really enjoyed this, possibly more than To Kill a Mockingbird, but I also read that book a couple years ago and I don't remember a lot of it. But I also don't usually enjoy reading books that are about children or follow the perspective of children, so that might be why I liked this one a little bit more, because we're following Scout, or Jean Louise, when she is older. I'm also a bit nervous about talking about this book because it's kind of controversial, especially the way that the author took these characters. They are very different from how we know them in To Kill a Mockingbird, and right away I knew this book was gonna be something because, I mean, not to spoil you, but in the first 10 pages, the author kills off a main character from the first book. And it's not even they die in this book, it's it's briefly mentioned in passing that oh, they're dead, and I was okay. What I will say is that even though the characters were taken in a different direction than a lot of people wanted them to be, and even myself, I found myself being a little bit annoyed with how certain characters went, at the end of the day, I think it was realistic, which is, reality is a hard fact to face, so while it wasn't the, thing that we wanted all these characters to live up to, I think it was realistic, and that has to count for something. Yeah, I'm obviously trying to be very vague because, like I said, well, for one, it would be kind of spoilers to really talk about it, but also it is kind of controversial, so I'm concerned about how much I am saying. But yeah, I did really enjoy this, and if you are interested in picking it up, I would recommend listening to the audiobook by Reese Witherspoon because she is really good at what she does, and she went all in with like the voices and everything, so I really appreciated that. And finally, I listened to Troublemaker on audio by Leah Remini, and it was also narrated by her. And again, I should preface this by saying I am not a Leah Remini fan. In fact, I have never seen anything of hers. I think she was in Friends, but I can't like specifically remember the episode, and I'm sure I probably have seen like an episode or two of King of Queens when it was like originally airing all those years ago. The reason I really wanted to pick this book up was because the tagline is like surviving Hollywood and Scientology, and I am very interested in Scientology and that whole wacky world going on, and I feel like anything I'd really heard about Scientology before came from like outside sources and their perspective, like looking in on it, so I was really interested in hearing her talk about it and what it was like coming from someone who was like right in the middle of it, and that's like exactly what I got from this book, and I absolutely loved it. I would highly recommend, if you want to pick this book up, listening to the audiobook because Leah Remini was really good, just like hearing it from her own voice. It was just really good, and she's also kind of funny, so there were some very humorous parts of this book as well. My favorite thing about this book was that you could tell that she did not hold back, and she is the kind of person that will like speak her mind no matter what, and like some of the things that she said in this book about like Tom Cruise and all of that, I was like, oh my goodness, but it was super interesting, and she does kind of give you a perspective of it. Like, again, looking from the outside in, you kind of think like, how would anybody want to like do that Scientology stuff? But then the way she describes it, you can tell how some people could get into that kind of thing. So yeah, I really enjoyed this book, and I would definitely recommend the audiobook if you're looking to pick it up. So those are all of the books that I read in April. If you've read any of these books, leave me a comment down below and tell me what you thought of them. I'd love to discuss them with you. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you in my next one. Bye!
You hear that, Samson?